Thomas Heskill Johnson is a legend around Taylor, Texas. Better known as T.H. Johnson, the well-known coach, teacher, and superintendent, came to Taylor in 1926 as assistant to Coach C.R. Drake. Taylor High School was in its fourth year at the new 7th Street campus, and 2 years earlier had been the now famous rainy season when local fans began calling the team Drake's Ducks. Already a seasoned professional with 3 previous districts in his resume, T.H. Johnson began a career in Taylor that would last the next 40 years and include a long list of awards and recognitions. One of the highest honors bestowed upon this local legend was the naming of this school T.H. Johnson Elementary. But who was T.H. Johnson? Why was he so loved in this town? And why did the citizens of Taylor want to name a school after him? That's what this story is all about. Thomas Heskill Johnson was born on January 2, 1901 in Johnson County, Texas. He attended schools in Sansom, Uvalde, and Waco. Heskill, as he was known during the early years, played football at Waco High School, graduating in 1920. He went on to Baylor University, where he continued to play football, and it was there that he met the love of his life, Martha Morgan. They later married in June of 1925. Johnson's first job was in Karnes City, where he served as high school principal as well as teacher and coach. The superintendent there described Mr. Johnson as a good disciplinarian, a very agreeable fellow, and is loyal. Next, he went to Gulf, Texas. The superintendent there said he is possessed of an unusual ability to lead boys, and his good character and fine fellowship make him a factor for good both on and off the school grounds. After that, T.H. Johnson went to Mahia as a teacher and coach, working for Superintendent C.A. Puckett, who had been Johnson's high school teacher in Waco. In a recommendation letter to Taylor ISD Superintendent R.H. Brister, Puckett said of Johnson, "He is a clean-minded, ambitious young man who is a good teacher and an athlete. He can be trusted with boys and sets an admirable example for them. My advice is to get him if you can." In a letter of application to Superintendent Brister, the 25-year-old Johnson said, "If this place is still open, I will be interested if the annual salary be $1,800 or more. If interested, wire me at my expense." The Taylor superintendent did hire Thomas Heskill Johnson, and that's when his 40-year legacy with the Taylor schools began. My name is Tim Crow, and it's my honor to serve as your host and narrator for this documentary about the life and career of Mr. T.H. Johnson. My own memories of Mr. Johnson are of his later years, although in 1965, his last year before retiring, Superintendent Johnson hired my father to teach Latin and world history at Taylor High School. Exactly 2 decades later, I began my own teaching career at the school named in his honor, T.H. Johnson Elementary. Many of the interviews for this project were recorded here in the Duck Room, also known as the Webb Room, the museum for over 100 years of history of the Taylor schools. A number of items from T.H. Johnson's career may be found here in the Duck Room, including his superintendent desk that greets visitors at the front entrance. To find out more about this local legend, we ask former students and colleagues, friends and family members to share some of their favorite memories about Thomas Heskill Johnson.
I was superintendent at Taylor from 1986 to 1993, I think. And during that time, I got to know Mr. Johnson fairly well. As a matter of fact, he would come almost monthly to the central office, and then he would invite me out to Plum, Texas. And if you wonder where that is, Mr. Johnson would say, it's Plum out of town. That was one of his little things. He had these little sayings that he enjoyed saying. But I got to know Mr. Johnson kind of as a legend.
I got to know who he was by watching him coach when I was 8 years old. And my parents moved close to town, and I could ride my bike or walk to football games. And he was an unbelievably outstanding coach. If you look at the records, back in those days, they could only go as far as regional. Had they been able to go to state, it's not no doubt in my mind that he wouldn't have won several state championships. I have an Uncle Charlie who had a son Calvin that was older than I was, and I even had the privilege of him picking me up and take me to out-of-town ball games. So I got to watch Mr. Johnson coach, and the Ducks keep winning for almost forever. And I could remember after the ball games when the Taylor won, if you didn't go to the game, all you had to do is listen because everybody drove up and down Main Street and honked their horn.
Coach Johnson was a legend, and anybody who knew him would agree with that. And you know, I can't remember a time when I didn't know Coach. I don't remember when I met him. I just remember he was always a very, very important part of my life. He was a teacher, he was a coach, he was a mentor, he was a husband, he was a dad. He was so many things to so many people, and truly loved by most every person who ever entered his life.
My dad's name, officially and on record, was Thomas Heskill Johnson. And Heskill was like Heskill, I believe. And my dad often said that his mother just didn't know how to spell Haskell, which was I think Haskell was a town name in that area. And she thought it was just a good name, and she thought that was what she wanted to name her little boy. But it just kind of got, well, anyway, my dad just always felt like she just didn't know what she was doing by naming him Heskill.
I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about a friendship I developed with T.H. Johnson that dates back to 1976. I came here out of college, was a sports editor at Taylor Daily Press, and one of the first calls I got was from Mr. Johnson. He actually came to see me and brought some books, first one being an annotated journal of Taylor High School from 1915 to 1975, all the coaches, their history, the games, the scores, and for somebody new to a job in the sports department, that was a tremendous advantage to have. And it turned into a really good friendship. I had many good conversations with him after that.
I moved to Taylor, Texas in the 8th grade, and that was my first meeting with Mr. Johnson. He was a history teacher and coach. I never had him as a teacher. And then he became superintendent when I was a sophomore in high school. And he was just this, such a joyous, jubilant man on campus. Everyone really admired him.
I never heard him say a foul word in my mouth, coming out of his mouth, I'm sorry. He was always a gentleman. I only saw him get mad one time, and a couple of players who were really good players and two nice guys. I never saw it on a football field before, but they both come out from a block or from a tackle holding each other by the shirt or by the jersey and looked like they were getting ready to hit each other. And I never saw Coach Johnson move so fast.
Well, my first remembrance of Mr. Johnson, and of course, as a young student in Taylor High School, that's how I always referred to him, as Mr. Johnson, was when he was superintendent. And this had been in the late 50s, early 60s, as I graduated in 62. But I'll go back a little further than that even, because my mother, who graduated in the late 30s, remembers him still as Coach Johnson.
Initially, I asked my boss, editor of the press, about Mr. Johnson. He told me he was a former coach and teacher for 20 years in Taylor, and then went on to serve as superintendent of schools for 20 years. Well, right away, I knew that meant a pretty solid commitment to the community, to the schools, and explained his love not only for coaching and teaching, but of the Ducks in general, and appreciated and respected everything that he had to say. I still have fond memories of the talks with him and the smiles on his face. Very congenial man. Never had to play for him as a football player, but as a retiree, great friend and great man, and get to know.
Well, today there was no way that I could have come into the duck room without being dressed like a duck, especially if I'm here to talk about a very good friend of mine who was a mentor. He was a true educator. He was my superintendent, and T.H. Johnson. So I had to wear my duck attire. I had to have the picture of the high school. And of course I had to say, once a duck, always a duck, because if ever there was a duck who lived, it was T.H. Johnson.
T.H. Johnson's career in Taylor began in 1926 as a teacher and as assistant coach to C.R. Drake. The plan was for Johnson to take over the backfield so that Drake could devote his time to the line. In the spring, they would divide the coaching duties for track and baseball. Taylor's rivalry with Georgetown was already intense by the time Johnson arrived. Prior to Drake's arrival in 1923, the Green and White had not won a game against the Eagles in 14 years, which dates back to a time when the Taylor football team had been a joint project between the city and the school. Since becoming a school sports event in 1912, Taylor had not won a single game against this bitter rival. For years, locals had referred to the jinx that Georgetown held over Taylor in football. It was an annual event that occurred each year on Armistice Day, November 11th. During Drake's first year here, Taylor held their fiercest opponent to a 0-0 tie, a huge accomplishment for the Green and White. The next year, 1924, Taylor narrowly defeated the Eagles with a 3-0 win, and that small win was enough to cause a celebration that carried over from the football field in Georgetown to a parade around the courthouse. Students said, "We were a-honking our horns and a-looking at all those sick-looking folks over there, and then we came home a-celebrating all the way. And then we had a bonfire, the biggest ever. We gave some yells and sang some songs and danced and pranced around the bonfire. And everybody was so happy that we decided to have a parade on Main Street. And then we went downtown, and stopped at each street light and were led in some more yells and songs. The excitement continued at a pep meeting the next day. Describing the audience as wildly overjoyed, the headline read, "Spirit of students bubbles into wild cheering over victory gained from Georgetown." All the boys who had played in the game were called upon the stage, where 15 raws were given for each man. The Ducks continued with another small win over Georgetown the next year. And then, in 1926, with T.H. Johnson now on the coaching staff, the Ducks had high hopes for huge successes over all their opponents, especially Georgetown. The 1926 season opened with much excitement and anticipation. As Taylor prepared for their first game at the Duck Pond against Lorena, it was noted that T.H. Johnson, new addition to Taylor High's coaching staff, had been working on forming tomorrow's backfield from promising but inexperienced material. Johnson's coaching strategy was quickly proven successful because the Ducks won that first game against Lorena 21-0. They tied the second game with Bartlett 0-0. And then leading up to the big game against Georgetown, the Ducks scored impressive wins against Trinity College and Round Rock 40-0, Smithville 28-0, Thorndale 6-0, and Rockdale 21-6. School spirits soared as the week of the big game against the Eagles arrived. Special cheers were written just for this top rival. On the Wednesday night before the Georgetown game, a huge crowd filled the auditorium for a pep rally that roared with thunderous cheers and laughter at cartoon slides of a harvest of eagle feathers. Yells, songs, and the reading of telegrams received from ex-students aroused the fighting pep of the rooters to the highest pitch. Coaches Drake and Johnson pledged that every man on the team would surpass his hardest fighting of all preceding games. The game was held at Snyder Field in Georgetown on November 11, 1926 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 2,000 were reported to be in attendance, and the Ducks won with their best score ever against the Eagles, Taylor 17, Georgetown 0. The school newspaper reported that anyone could have kept up with the game simply by watching T.H. Johnson's cap getting thrown up, down, and sideways during the game. When the Ducks made a good play, the cap went up. When they made a bad play, the cap went down. When the ball was in the air, Mr. Johnson stood with the cap in his hand, poised, waiting to throw it one way or the other. When the ball finally reached its destination, it was easy to see whether or not the pass was completed by the direction in which the cap went. The Cotton Bowl also reported, with an undefeated team within 2 games of district championship, Mr. Drake attributes a large portion of the season's success to the aggressive work done by assistant coach Johnson in drilling the backfield men. This has perfected the teamwork of Drake's fighting machine. School spirit was at an all-time high, as could be seen by the high-energy pep rallies that turned into shirt-tail parades down Main Street, and the green and white checkered Ford driven around the school by one of the students to proudly show off the school colors. The team of C.R. Drake and T.H. Johnson proved to be a winning combination, and T.H. Johnson's first year with the Ducks had been the team's best football season to date. Success was celebrated with a banquet held in the Industrial Arts Department, It was an annual event given by Coach Drake, who was a hunter and a fisherman, and this year the menu consisted of deer meat and fish. Dessert was chocolate cake in the shape of a football and ice cream. Place cards were small footballs with the word undefeated. In the center of the table was a miniature goalpost with a card suspended from the crossbar that showed the scores from the past 4 years of the Taylor-Georgetown games. The Cotton Bowl reported that Coach C.R. Drake entertained the whole football squad, the yell-leading squad, and a few faculty members at this banquet. The feast was announced for 8 o'clock, but most of the boys were there by 7:30. One of the team members that year was Andrew Tarkington, who went on to become president of Continental Oil Company, which later became Conoco. Tarkington was also in the school orchestra, a member of the Taylor High Hall of Fame, and was voted Best All-Around Boy, Most Talented Boy, and Best Looking Boy. We know this because of the detailed records that T.H. Johnson kept each year about his team and the school. Over the years, Coach Johnson became well known for recording the history of just about everything, especially duck football. He created books of records and notes during his entire career, and in the book entitled Football, Taylor High School Ducks, 1926 to 1932, he kept a 147-page history of his first 7 years in Taylor as assistant coach. T.H. Johnson's first year in Taylor turned out to be the Ducks' best football season yet. Winning quickly became the tradition, and Coach Johnson became one of the most loved and respected leaders to ever wear the green and white.
Started with Coach Johnson as a mascot back in 1936. The way I got the job was real simple. I'm a little guy in second grade, and I walked up to him and said, "Coach Johnson?" He's looking down at me naturally. I said, "I want to be mascot." And I don't remember why I gave him all the reasons, but at that time my brother Sidney was playing football for him and went on to be a captain of the football team later on. But anyway, I said, "Well, Coach, I'd like to be the mascot of this team." And obviously I wasn't very shy. And he looked down at me and said, "Okay, you're the mascot. Now," he said, "go over there and sit down and don't say anything." And because he was coaching. And that's how I got to be the mascot. And I was a mascot from 1936 through 1939. Actually, I stayed the mascot that length because I started to outgrow my uniform. I led those teams. The mascot ran out with the team and led them out. I led them out for 4 years when I was a mascot, and then I was a captain of the last team, the last undefeated team Taylor had.
The football games were, of course, incredible. They were just wonderful, especially since we always won. I never did know what it was to lose because we won. We had a winning season, several seasons. In fact, all through my high school years, we won, and we had that record of most consecutive wins. Coach was, I like to say he was the epitome of that saying, win without boasting, lose without excuse. Well, of course, he didn't have to worry about losing because he didn't have to have any excuses because we didn't do much losing. But he won very graciously, and he taught us to do the same thing. We were so proud of our team. We were so proud of our town. We were so proud of our duck. And it was so exciting. And all of our everything about him came from him. He led from the top, and he just taught us how to be gracious winners.
And he never made any great fight songs or fight speeches before a game. He would always warn us, constantly warn us, as he would tell us, and it seemed like he told us all the time, sooner or later, he'd come up with, this team that's coming here today, they may have lost 10 games in a row, but their one big thing was to beat Taylor. If they beat Taylor, they made their season. That's all they cared about. And when you constantly win, that's the thing that everybody looked for. And the old saying, wherever we went, the other side would always say, we're going to make duck soup out of you. We're going to make duck soup. And of course, our answer was just to agree with them. Yeah, y'all probably will. I remember saying that 10 times. Oh, y'all probably will. And Coach would always say, well, we don't have much team out here, but we're doing all right. I'm building character this year. And that was sort of a famous saying he'd say over and over. He did tell us, I remember that he said, one year it came out in the headlines at the Taylor paper, Taylor Ducks are sunk. They're sunk, said Coach Johnson. Only 18 players showed up. Well, the next day he's out there talking to us. He says, well, boys, and he always chuckled. He says, don't pay any attention to what I tell those people downtown. We're not sunk. We're going to play ball as tradition. And you don't want to be, he always said this, you don't want to be the team that breaks tradition around here. We're always winning. We're winners. We play.
Well, I think the desire to win was the big motivational factor, and then it got to be a tradition, and one that he could build on, and I think I've heard him talk about that, you know, about the tradition of winning, and but also how good it makes you feel. So.
I recall Coach saying on more than one occasion, if you guys are going to lose a game, or you gentlemen, or you fellas, whatever you call us, if you boys are going to lose a game, make it the last one of the season. I don't want to come out here as a loser in practice. So consequently, I will say, in my tenure on the A team, or the varsity, I never practiced as a loser.
He would have funny stories. For instance, he said they could not get a large amount of hot water.
I guess his favorite story, the one I remember the most because of the smiles on his face when he told it, was about the showers at the field house. I thought it was kind of strange until he got into the story, and then I realized this man had a great sense of humor. He's been playing on the field. They started in 1933. They never had hot water for the showers until 1947. He said as a courtesy to his opponents when they came, he would keep his team on the field and let the visitors go take the shower first. What they learned to appreciate was the fact that Taylor's water came from artesian wells, and it came out of the ground cold. And he said you could actually hear the screams at City Hall once they turned the water on. But he said by the time his team and boys got in there to shower, the wells had brought the warm water up, and they got to experience a nice warm shower. And I always thought to myself, you know, no wonder he's smiling. I just wonder how many times they fell for that over the course of the years. But I guess if you need a shower, you need a shower.
But he was a character that way, kind of a rascal.
But my sophomore year, he did come up to me. The first time I recall him ever calling me to the side to talk to me, it was the Belton game, about the third game of the season. And he said, well, I'm going to start you tonight. Boy, that excited me, because all my life I dreamed football at Taylor, along with my brother being older and the few friends I had older. It was just a way of life that I wanted to just look forward to. I didn't care about going to high school. I cared about playing football. And I'd say a good deal of us felt that way, playing under Coach Johnson. So anyway, I started out my sophomore year, starting the Belton game, and through it'd be 1945. I got to start every game that we played in, with the exception of one, and I was hurt.
His football boys loved him. They adored him. They would probably they would have gone to the ends of the earth for him. And Taylor was winning, and success breeds success.
Of course, I was not a part of the team because I was a cheerleader, but it was always obvious to me and to all the other girlfriends of mine that the guys had such respect for him. They just absolutely idolized him, and it was so important to please him, to do well for him. And that carried into every part of his life, in his teaching and as a family man, everything. It just that people wanted to please him. And the boys, as I say, had the greatest respect in the world for him, and they wanted to be the best for him.
Coach Johnson didn't talk to you a whole lot. He talked to the quarterbacks quite a bit. He, naturally, they're the boys that call the game. And you don't realize that we would practice, and when we got to the A team, the main team, we've been playing these plays, most of us, since we were in the sixth grade. And I'd been out there since I was in the second grade, so you knew your plays, and you generally knew everybody else's play, what they did. And it was just a case of repetition. And through all those years that we played ball for him, I don't recall him ever putting in maybe 3 or 4 more different plays. We always ran from a double wing, a single wing, and a punt formation. And on occasion, we'd have an unbalanced line or a spread, but we did very, very little of that. This is Taylor High football, and this went on the whole 10 years I was associated with them. Nothing changed much. You just drilled, you drilled, and you drilled. And the way I understood it is if everybody did their job, you could tell them, you're going to run off tackle, everybody does a block, the guy will go on and run the play and make a touchdown. That was the whole idea, or his theory, I suppose. Our defenses never changed much. We always either ran a 6-man line or a 5-man line. We would adjust ourselves during the game, and you got to remember, back in those days, you couldn't send players in all the time. They did that because the teams were all small, 30 to 35, and some of the teams wouldn't have but about 24 players. So if you let substitutes come in all the time, a big school could just wear you out by running players in. Well, that was one of the rules. And you couldn't go in any time. You could go in a quarter, but if you came out, you could not go back in that same quarter at the same position. And there were several rules like that.
While Coach Johnson's first year in Taylor was the first of many successes, the next year, 1927, had its challenges. The season began with high hopes for another victory over Georgetown, but there were obvious concerns with only 5 lettermen returning and 24 rookies on the team. Coach Johnson also said there had been some changes in the lineup that year due to some of the boys being delinquent in their grades and were ineligible to play. And one of the Ducks' best players was out for the season after having surgery for appendicitis. For the past 4 years, no Eagle had been allowed to cross the green and white goal line, but this year would be tough, and the Ducks knew their old rival would return, bringing their fiercest fight yet. The day before the game, the Cotton Bowl reported, "When the shadows begin to lengthen on the THS Athletic Park tomorrow afternoon, the Ducks will have finished another historic, colorful grid clash with their old rivals, the Eagles." Georgetown came back to win over Taylor 12-7, and the Eagles claimed the District 12B championship. The Cotton Bowl reported that the Ducks failed by 1 touchdown to beat the Georgetown Eagles after outclassing them before a wildly cheering crowd of 3,000 in the annual Duck-Eagle Armistice Day clash. It was noted that although the Ducks came up short on points, they made more first downs, completed more passes, and established a better punting average than their opponent. Although the school sports editor expressed frustration at the impact failing grades had on the season, coaches Drake and Johnson praised the boys at the annual banquet. After a feast of fried chicken and all its accompaniments, Drake told how he enjoyed working with all the boys and that he considered them a fine bunch of kids. Sam Southern, who would be the team captain for the following year, said they expected to pour it on Georgetown the next year. The players also showed their appreciation to the coaches with a presentation of gifts at the Friday morning assembly. They presented Coach Drake with a collegiate alligator skin slicker of a blazing yellow hue, and for Coach Johnson, they presented a fountain pen and pencil set. It was said that these gifts represented a visible expression of the understanding which comes from the deep friendship and close cooperation of the coaches and the team, qualities that T.H. Johnson was known for the rest of his life and is still remembered for today.
Our house was not very far away from the football field, and he used to walk to the football field from after he came home from teaching, and he would change clothes into his workout suit and would then return home. And I remember that the shoes always had cleats on the bottom of them. Well, cleats and cement make a very distinctive sound, and I could always tell when he was on his way home or getting near home because of the sound of those shoes. And I can still think about that. Well, we only had one car at that time, and so everybody did what you had to do to get around.
I always tell the joke, and Coach didn't like the joke very much, but I had the opportunity to see more football games than he did. Sadly, his father died in 1942, and before his father had died, our assistant coach, who was Mr. Andrews, P.M. Andrews, his father had died. So Coach Andrews left us, and the next day, Coach Johnson's father died, and he had to leave to go to the funeral. So it left us just before we go to Groesbeck to play the regional championship without a coach. Mr. Robbins, the superintendent, came out, and Cotton Jurassic was our captain, and he took control. We borrowed a school bus. The war had started, was going on, and school ration was going, and Taylor didn't have a school bus in those days. The way we got to football games was either ride with somebody from Taylor or one of the football players would drive a car or two themselves. We always had to hitchhike rides, take the equipment with us. But for the 1942 game, Cameron loaned us the bus to go. We left Taylor without a football coach. We didn't have but about 2 or 3 days of practice to go to a regional championship. And as we pulled into town at Groesbeck, I remember well, Mr. Andrews was coming up the street in his car. And we didn't know if we were going to have a coach or not, how we were going to handle it. I don't recall that. But boy, we were happy to see him, and I remember we were all yelling at him out of the bus as he drove by. And Mr. Andrews took us, and he started the first team. He never took a player out of the game. He certainly didn't send the play into the game. And the only substitute we made was a fellow by the name of Jack Slack. He was our kicker. And the question I always wondered, I didn't go out, I was a freshman, but I didn't go out of the game, and I often wondered who came out of the game. And I don't recall who our holder was. It couldn't have been the quarterback, certainly it wasn't him. I would think he would normally be the holder. So it had to be, it couldn't be the captain that was left, I didn't think, so I got it down to a fellow by the name of Dave Swinson.
I think one of the funniest things that ever happened in our high school, and I think Coach Johnson was as surprised as anybody, but we had a young man named L.M. who had never played football in his life, and he had been in the band and was a drum major. But his senior year, well, I think he had some health issues, and that's why he had not played football. It was too strenuous. But his senior year, he decided he wanted to play. And, you know, some of the kids were kind of laughing at him behind his back, like, are you serious? You've never played, now suddenly in your senior year and you're going to play football. But Coach Johnson believed in him and gave him a chance. He thought, if he's serious and he wants to play football, he has a right to play football just like anybody else. So he let LM play, and he coached him just like he coached everybody else, gave him the same opportunities, and worked with him the same amount of time. Never once made any fun of him at all. Of course not, that wasn't in his nature. And sure enough, guess what? In one of our first games, LM got the ball and ran 90 yards for a touchdown. And there was not anybody any prouder than Coach Johnson was at that moment. We were all cheering. We were all so excited that, you know, this boy makes good. Hooray, hooray. But Coach Johnson was so proud of him because I think there was something inside him that said, see there, guys, don't ever sell anybody short. There's always some talent in there, and you just need to bring it out. And he brought it out.
1929 was Drake's last season with the Ducks. Coach Johnson noted that C.R. Ruby Drake had been an all-conference tackle at A&M University. Mr. Drake coached the Taylor Ducks until 1930, when he resigned to work for Texas Power and Light Company. Later, he coached at Mansfield, Louisiana, where he died in the early 1940s. Eugene Lambert took over the head coaching duties from 1930 through 1932, with Coach Johnson continuing to serve as assistant. Lambert's last season with the Ducks was 1932, and in 1933, T.H. Johnson was named Taylor's head football coach without an assistant. Mr. Johnson, it is understood, will have full responsibility of the coaching work, and there will be no additional coach employed. Mr. Johnson is head of the history department, teaches 3 classes in American history, and also 2 classes in biology. Johnson later recalled accepting this new assignment, saying, I took the head coaching position without any help for $1,560 for the 9 months school year, 1933 to 1934. 14 years later, at the end of my coaching assignment, I was receiving $3,600 per year. Coach Johnson was known for saying, "Win is our slogan," and win they did. Johnson's record as head coach included 7 district titles, 6 regional titles, 4 unbeaten seasons, and a 30-game winning streak. And all of that success happened without a well-kept football field like the one we know today. Coach Johnson described the playing field during his coaching years as rocky and sloped toward the south, which caused the north goal to be 3 feet higher than the south goal. Rocks of various sizes were in abundance, which required a rock gathering squad before a game. What grass existed on the field when the season started was soon gone, and for the rest of the season, the turf consisted of hard black soil. The managers and coaches lined off the field prior to the game, using a bucket as a line marker. Usually the lines were so wide, Johnson said, we often commented that it took at least 2 downs to get across the line. Johnson also said the larger rocks were painted white so the duck backs could sidestep them. It wasn't until 1947, after Johnson became superintendent, that improvements were made to the field. During T.H. Johnson's first year as head coach, lights were installed at the duck pond. An investment of $1,550, these floodlights consisted of 4 posts to each side with 4 reflectors to a post. A total of 32 light units of 1,500 watts each. The first event under these new lights was the pep rally held the night before the Belton game, and the yell leader said this new addition added much pep to the rally. The Belton game was held on October 27, 1933, and marked the first time for a night football game to be played in Taylor. The Ducks beat the Belton Tigers that night 13-0. Taylor fans paid 45 cents to see a game in 1933, while the student price was 25 cents. Season tickets that year were $1.50 for adults and $1 for students. The average weight of the Ducks in 1933 was 169 for the line and 146 for the backfield. Green satin pants were first worn by the Ducks during the 1936 season. Prior to this, the pants worn in a game were the same as those used in practice. Dressed up in satin, the Ducks lost 1 game in 1936. Every year, Coach Johnson sent welcoming postcards to team members before practices began. He always referred to all the boys he coached as his boys, and always spoke highly of each one. Even in later years, when many of his former football players had become senior citizens themselves, they were still his boys. Coach Johnson was well known for building his team and building relationships. Lifelong friendships developed, and he often kept in touch with former students for years after they graduated from high school. It wasn't until 1935 that an assistant coach, Dan Hannon, was hired, and later Coach Paul Andrews. Coach Dan Hannon was a Taylor boy, having graduated from St. Mary's High School. Prior to coming to Taylor, Hannon taught and coached at Granger High School. Coach Hannon resigned to enter the U.S. Navy in 1942, returning to his coaching position in 1945. He became head football coach in 1946 when Coach T.H. Johnson was named superintendent. And then Hannon resigned in 1949 when President Harry Truman nominated him for the position of postmaster of the Taylor Post Office. World War II had a profound effect on communities and schools. Students were urged to help with the war effort by purchasing stamps and bonds. Assemblies were held to discuss wartime topics. There was practice for air raid drills, and numerous high school students registered to do their part as air raid wardens, first aid applicants, and for numerous other tasks of the nation's and city's defense. Elementary schools emphasized patriotism and began a silent prayer time. The Red Cross trained in first aid, and teachers helped issue the sugar rations, just one of the items suddenly in short supply that Americans were no longer able to purchase whenever they wanted. Many ex-students of Taylor High School were serving their country, and Coach Hannon was the first of 3 faculty members called into service. And then the reality of war hit close to home, with headlines of recent graduates now missing in action or killed in action. Older brothers, neighbors, and friends who would not be returning home. School pride remained strong during these difficult times, and the Ducks continued winning. But Coach Johnson said World War II had a massive influence on football as well, calling 1942, 1943, and 1944 tough years. Many colleges abandoned football, although high schools fared a little better. During 2 seasons, 1943 and 1944, the Ducks had only one coach, T.H. Johnson. Good teams developed even with a skeletal coaching staff and travel and scouting difficulties. During that time, the Ducks played 31 games, won 30, lost 1, and tied 0, scoring 908 points to the opponent's 85. Speaking of the challenges during World War II, Johnson said, "With gas rationing and no assistant coach, I instituted scouting the opponents by letter. It was proposed to the opposing coaches that we exchange certain information about our teams as scouting material. The response was one of willingness and cooperation." With all the challenges of the 1940s, T.H. Johnson's daughter, Dorothy, or DJ, said her dad still called them the golden years. In an Austin American Statesman article in 1970, George Brazil said the span from 1926 through 1946, which were T.H. Johnson's 20 years of coaching, that Taylor teams terrorized the countryside, winning 175 games, losing only 35, and tying 9. He also said when Johnson became head coach in 1933, the handwriting went on the wall for Duck foes, and that Johnson hewed a dynasty, the likes of which Central Texas may never see again. Over the period of 1938 through 1945, the Ducks won 7 district championships, 6 by-district trophies, and 5 regional flags. The district crown that got away occurred in 1944 when Taylor's finest back was hurt, and Killeen won the championship game, breaking a 30-game winning streak. From 1938 through 1945, the Mallards lost only 6 games in 8 years and scored a total of 2,234 points to the opponent's 365.
A fellow by the name of Dave Swinson. Dave went on to graduate from Annapolis, and he was the only, and he was one of our boys or one of our classmates of the dozen or so that were killed in action. He was killed at the Incheon landing and buried at sea. It was a very, and my brother, who's also a captain of a football team, as I mentioned earlier, in 1938, he was killed at Pearl Harbor. But we had about 12 to 15 boys, as I remember, that were killed in action or missing in action from the different wars. We had one of our B team players who left school early. Ernie was his first name, and I can't think of it. I think it was Ernie Dietz. And he was MIA at Peleliu as a Marine. And we had another boy leave early from high school who was on the USS Houston. He was probably my senior or junior, well, it was in 1944, so it was probably my sophomore and junior year. He was a classmate. He was on the USS Houston at the Normandy landing. And mentioning all these boys, I would say, without a doubt and with hesitation, I can find it out, but I will say from all the kids that played football from coach or even graduated from high school, I would say 95% of the boys going to school in those days, playing football or not, went to the military until 1945. My class was the last class that all the boys didn't go, or 99% of them didn't go to the service.
One of the first stories I remember him telling me was about the duck pond, and how in 1933, when he became head coach, one of the first things they did was put lights on the field. And he took great pride in the fact that the lights were only the second duck pond was only the second lighted field in Central Texas, the first being Austin High. And the Ducks actually won their first game that year under the lights against Belton by a score of 13-0. So he was proud of that, and as well he should be. It was a good accomplishment and a nice feature for the duck pond.
You know, when we were in high school, as I have told you many times before, there was World War II was in progress, and so there were many limitations on us. Excuse me. We couldn't do the things that kids enjoy doing today. So we spent most of the time at each other's homes. And Coach Johnson and Ms. Johnson's home was one of the centers. That's where we spent a lot of time. And I remember back then, he and Mrs. Johnson always made their presence when all the kids gathered there usually on a Saturday night, because we wanted to dance and we wanted to talk, and they would make their presence known so that we were aware that if there should be any problems, they were there to help us. And they were also to see that we didn't get in any trouble. But they left us, they'd leave. The minute they made their presence, then they left. I don't know, they went in the bedroom, I guess. It was a small home, and left the rest of us to have a good time. And just obviously the perfect chaperone.
He had a lot of little things that he liked that I recall him later on after I got to know him after high school. He would always brag on the fact that we beat Brady one year. Well, we beat him for a regional championship. And that particular team was coached by General Rudder Hall at A&M. He was the coach at Brady back in 1938, and we beat him. And Coach always kind of chuckled and say, well, I beat a general once. And we had a few boys that did all right. We had one boy, Delbert Nichols, who went on to be a general officer in the Texas National Guard. Some of you will remember him probably. We had another boy that ran the largest refinery in England. His name was Rudy Horsack. And then we had another fellow that I didn't know was before my time. His name was Tarkington, something like that. He was president of Conoco. And Coach Johnson saw the name once, so he wrote the fella, and he said, well, I had a fella by that name. Did you happen to go to school here in Taylor? And the guy wrote him back and said, yes, Coach, I played football for you. And he was very proud of that. I remember him very proud of it.
Coach Johnson set out to win every game the Ducks played, and winning the annual game against Georgetown continued to be a top priority, including having 3 pep rallies in one day to get ready for the big Armistice Day game. Taylor had reversed the jinx, and according to a 1951 Cotton Bowl article, after 14 lean years for Georgetown, the Eagles finally defeated the Ducks in 1948. Reports included news that the win was such a big victory for the Eagles that the school declared a holiday. And through it all, including the fiercest competition with Taylor's most bitter rival, there was still a sense of sportsmanship after each game was over. Looking back at his years as Taylor's head football coach, T.H. Johnson said these football memories concern 216 boys and 3 coaches who played a vital role in building the football fortunes, records, and heritage of the Taylor High Ducks. Coach Johnson dedicated this particular book to those 216 boys who during this time made Taylor High School football a potent force in the community and in Central Texas. T.H. Johnson was a mentor and role model for so many, but who were his mentors? When Coach Johnson was a quarterback at Waco High School, his coach was the legendary Paul Tyson, one of the most successful high school football coaches of all time. Johnson said Tyson devoted himself to the game entirely and was years ahead of other high schools at the time. Coach Johnson was also influenced by well-known Notre Dame football coach Knute Rockne and successful Wisconsin basketball coach W.E. Meanwell and the famous Coach Pop Warner. Rockne and Meanwell partnered to create the Rockne Meanwell Coaching School, which had segments for both football and basketball. These coaching schools traveled around the country, and T.H. Johnson attended the first one in Texas, held at Austin in 1925. A framed certificate from this coaching school hangs on the wall of the Johnson family home in Plum, Texas, signed by both Rockne and Meanwell. Coaches Johnson and Drake attended another Rockne Meanwell School of Coaching in 1929 in Dallas. In addition to Knute Rockne, this school was also conducted by Coach Pop Warner. Johnson's daughter Dorothy recalled that her dad attended several of these coaching schools over the years. News of T.H. Johnson's incredible success spread well beyond the Central Texas area. In 1930, 2 filmmakers from San Antonio came to Taylor to take what was called at that time moving pictures of students in the Taylor Public Schools. They filmed students at each campus, as well as football practice at the duck pond. The Cotton Bowl reported that Coach Johnson and Captain Jimmy Richter were featured in a separate moving picture of their own. Not long after that, it appears that news of T.H. Johnson's success with the Ducks gained national attention. A couple of Cotton Bowl reporters discovered just how famous T.H. Johnson had become while talking with a Killeen journalist at the Taylor-Killeen game in 1951. The journalist told the high school reporters that Coach Johnson and the Taylor Ducks had received a mention in Bob Ripley's Believe It or Not column because of their undefeated seasons from 1930 to 1935. The journalist called Coach Johnson one of the greatest high school coaches he had ever seen. Then in 1941, word of Coach Johnson and the winning Taylor Ducks reached Walt Disney, and Mr. Disney sent an autographed Donald Duck drawing to Coach Johnson and the team. When Johnson became superintendent, he displayed that framed autograph on a filing cabinet in his office. After his death in 2000, his daughter, Dorothy Elliott, donated the treasure to the Taylor High School Ex-Students Association. The original is safely locked away, but copies are proudly displayed all around the district. Coach Johnson included the Disney duck on the cover of several of the books he made, but the only information he included about the gift was that he received it in 1941. The friends and family members we spoke with assumed that either Coach Johnson or one of the football players had written to Mr. Disney with a request for the autographed duck.
It was sent to the class of 41, as I recall. Someone in the class wrote for it, we got it, and it is now our symbol. But I do not know any more than that. I remember when Taylor High School's high school song came out, that was from the class of 41. Mr. Nolan was the director, and Patricia Gossett wrote the words to it, and they coordinated their efforts. That came from the class of 41 also.
And in his office, on top of his filing cabinet, was the original Taylor duck from Walt Disney, signed by Walt Disney, and that was on top of his cabinet. I knew that it was it looked a lot like the Walt Disney duck, and but I never really ever questioned my dad on how it came to be that Walt Disney sent his version of the duck to our school, and so I can't really give you any inside details on that.
One of the things that, of course, we're most proud of here in Taylor, Texas, is the fact that we have an autograph that is signed by Walt Disney. While T.H. Johnson was head coach, he evidently contacted Walt Disney and in communication let him know that we were the Taylor Ducks. And so Walt Disney drew that famous Disney duck and autographed it. And we have it in our vault at Taylor ISD Central Office. A couple of years ago, Dorothy Elliott, his daughter, did present a letter to the Taylor High School Ex-Students Association saying that the duck, autographed copy of the Walt Disney duck actually belongs to the Taylor High School Ex-Students Association.
Just as this film project was nearing completion, a short article was discovered in a 1951 Cotton Bowl with the story of how T.H. Johnson came to receive the autograph. It seems that a sports writer with the San Antonio Evening News named Perry Winkley wrote to Walt Disney telling him about the Taylor Ducks and suggesting that he honor the coach and the team with a drawing of Donald Duck. Soon after that, Mr. Johnson received a picture of Donald with the inscription, "To the Taylor High School Ducks, Greetings, Walt Disney." The story of the Disney autograph was shared with the community in a front-page article in the Taylor Press. While much has been said about T.H. Johnson's work as a coach, he also taught biology, civics, economics, and physical education during his time in the classroom. When he became head coach in 1933, Mr. Johnson had full responsibility of the coaching work without an assistant coach. He was also head of the history department, taught 3 classes of American history and 2 classes of biology. Known for his knowledge of local history, T.H. Johnson was a valuable resource for the Cotton Bowl staff of 1940 when they decided to learn about the early days of Taylor and publish an entire issue with the theme Taylor and Her History. Mr. Johnson loaned them several 1905 issues of the Taylor Daily Democrat, the Taylor Journal, and the Taylor Weekly Texan, from which a great part of the material used in this special issue was obtained. As highly respected as he was for his coaching skills, T.H. Johnson was also known as an excellent teacher, making the topics fun and interesting for his students.
Coach was most known for being a coach, but maybe everybody didn't know that he was a fabulous teacher. He taught me American history, and he made me love history. And it's not easy to love history sometimes. It can get pretty boring, but he made it so interesting. And we had a lot of fun in his class. You know, Coach Johnson had a way of, we always knew he was the adult and that he was the authoritative person, and yet there was a side of him that he let us have fun with. And we weren't his best friends, I don't mean that, but we just had fun with him, but we still had that respect for him. And we were notorious for writing notes to each other in class when he wasn't looking. If we were supposed to be working on something or reading a chapter or something, it was a lot more fun to write notes. And so Tootsie and Jerry and I, those were two of my friends, classmates, and we wrote notes back and forth all the time. And he was aware of what we were doing. We were not fooling anybody, but one day he just got enough of it, I guess, and so he just calmly got up, never changed the expression on his face, and he walked over and got up just as close to Tootsie as he could, and he just put out his hand like this. Like, you know, put it in my hand. And so she forfeited her note, put it in his hand, and looked at him kind of sheepishly, and he closed it up, and he turned around, walked back over to the class, and just started right where he had left off, you know. And after class, we worried about it, and we worried about, oh, he's going to read it, and we're going to be in a lot of trouble, and never mentioned, never, ever mentioned that note. He just let us worry about that someday we would be in trouble. It was always kind of hanging over us that he had, and in fact, I think he probably collected 2 or 3 of those during the course of that class. But as I say, it was fun, and but more importantly, we learned a lot because he was such an excellent teacher.
Although he did teach history, but he must have also taught science classes, because I can remember him grading papers, and the kids had just done a beautiful job, I thought. Of course, I was just a little kid, but they drew all kinds of parts of the body and everything like that, and so I was very impressed with his years of teaching science. Although later on, he when he taught American history, the Civil War was his favorite time of that period, and so we did a lot of blackboard battles where the North and the South would determine the outcome of that campaign.
The thing I remember about Mr. Johnson, my older sister Rosalie had him for history, and she bragged on him what a great history teacher he was. So he was all about business, and he was a dedicated man. And I can tell you, for my coaching experience and the fishing experiences, some of your best coaches are great classroom teachers and take great pride in being that. And if students are lucky to have a coach like that is a good classroom teacher, they're very fortunate.
He didn't cut me any slack, that's for sure. And I know one time he gave a test, and I made a 47 on it, and he was just mortified that I would have done so poorly on that. And I thought, oh, that's terrible. So I always paid attention to test time from then on. Teachers traditionally have been terribly underpaid, and I think anybody would know that, especially, well, just anybody would know that, I would think. But anyway, yes, and so I think his salary at one point was maybe $95 a month, and then because of the Depression, it was reduced to $90, and so Mother used to say she wouldn't even buy a handkerchief if it wasn't in the budget. So, and she made all of my clothes.
School opened on September 4th, 1947, with a new superintendent. At the end of the 1946-47 school year, Superintendent Edward Robbins resigned to accept the position of superintendent of the Alamo Heights Schools in San Antonio. Coach T.H. Johnson wrote a letter of application to Taylor School Board Chairman Mr. Hunter Miles expressing his desire to be promoted. It was announced in the May 23rd Cotton Bowl that T.H. Johnson would be leaving the job he had become so well known for to become the next superintendent of the Taylor schools, a position in which he would serve for the next 19 years. In December of that year, an article in the Taylor Daily Press stated that while it has taken 6 months for the people of Taylor to change from Coach to Mr. Johnson, and even some of us still slip at times, it did not take long for the people of Taylor to realize that they had a real superintendent of schools in the person of T.H. Johnson, just as they had an outstanding athletic coach in the past. In the Cotton Bowl column entitled Orchids and Onions, orchids were awarded to Mr. Johnson, saying he has been working very hard to make a success out of his job, and the students and faculty are helping him in every possible way. The column noted that Mr. Johnson has brought about many needed reforms, including one in particular that has affected everyone: the presence of water coolers. It went on to say, it is a certainty that Mr. Johnson goes beyond his duty in many cases in order to make this school a better place in which to study and play. It was said that Mr. Johnson brought the same zest and zeal to the office of superintendent that he displayed as head coach. The same care and concern that built strong relationships with his football teams was also evident in his role as the district's top administrator. For the entire time that Mr. Johnson served as superintendent, the Central Administration Office consisted of 2 people, the superintendent and his secretary. The superintendent's office was located in the main office of the high school. Originally, the room where the school board met was at the back of the main office, with the superintendent's office to the left and the principal's office to the right. Later, the boardroom was moved to the left in front of Superintendent Johnson's office, and 2 secretaries, one for the superintendent and one for the principal, occupied the center area at the back. Mr. Johnson always took a hands-on approach to leadership. He typed part of the board book himself, with 2 fingers on a manual typewriter, and he helped the secretaries assemble the copies for the board members prior to each month's meeting. He also served as assistant secretary on the board. Mr. Johnson was often seen in the hallways of Taylor High School and the other campuses, taking an interest in everyone and everything that took place on school grounds. He was also known for his involvement in the community and educational organizations beyond the local district. A few of the highlights Mr. Johnson listed from his 19 years as superintendent include expanding the music program to include elementary schools, expanding the lunchroom operation to include 5 schools, provision for full-time clerical assistants for elementary and high school principals, coordinating the proposed building program, which resulted in the construction of the high school on North Main Street, the construction of Northside School, the West End Lunch Building, and the junior high building, which later came to be known as the Annex. It was also during this time that the Taylor Independent School District was created by separation from municipal control. 3 bond issues were passed without a tax increase. Programs for preschool children were instituted. School programs expanded to include driver education, sociology, advanced math, power mechanics, distributive education, and art. Participation in scholarship offerings, specifically the generous Mulaski and Gernert Scholarship Funds. At Eastside School, vocational agriculture, physical education, typing, shorthand, bookkeeping, chemistry, physics, and music were added. And one of the last major projects Mr. Johnson worked on before retiring was administering the integration program in the Taylor schools. On May 17th of 1954, in Brown v. Board of Education, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment. The 1954 decision declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by Congress and signed into law on July 2, 1964, by President Lyndon B. Johnson. To comply, a program of desegregation in public schools was to begin immediately. On February 11th of 1965, T.H. Johnson submitted the plan to the Taylor Board of Trustees to comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Known for tremendous success in all of his roles, Mr. Johnson was often asked to speak to various audiences. In one particular speech entitled Effective Learning for Good Schools, Mr. Johnson shared some of his thoughts about successful schools, including, "The teacher is the most important person in the school system. The academic program comes first, and extracurricular activities should be geared to fit smoothly into the whole scheme of learning. The home should have educational goals and functions, and every person in the community should share with us in the challenging responsibility of education." During the last few years of his superintendency, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson moved to the family farm at Plum, Texas. Mrs. Johnson loved this place. She felt the most comfortable here, and they planned to eventually retire here. So for several years, Mr. Johnson drove back to work in Taylor each day.
And when I was about in the 9th grade, he retired from coaching and became the superintendent of schools and did an excellent job. Had everybody's respect. He was very quiet. I've never heard him raise his voice. He didn't laugh out loud, but he smiled a lot. And he had a certain presence about him.
People would come into to the office just to visit with Mr. Johnson. And he was always welcoming and nice and polite to us. And I mean, he was just so good to work with. I just could not have had a better boss.
It was not an unusual thing for successful and well-respected coaches and what all to later on go into school administration. Many did that, and while some were more successful than others, and I think that's where you'd put Mr. Johnson, he was certainly successful because he had the respect and understanding of the community. And there have been other folks who have done that, gone from coaching into administration or whatever, not quite as successful. Mr. Johnson was very successful at what he did.
I got to know him on not too good of terms when I was a senior in high school, and I was in the chemistry classroom, and it was elevated, and I was sitting next to the windows on the east side with a ag building across the street. And I was enjoying class, listening to Miss Wilson teach, and my knuckleheaded friend next to me decided he would take my textbook and throw it out the window. And so we had a little discussion there briefly, and not being too sound of mind, I grabbed his textbook and threw it out the window. It so happened that I had a long sleeve green shirt on. And about 5 minutes later, the secretary appeared at the door, and she said, told Miss Wilson, I want to see the guy in the long sleeve green shirt. Well, man, I was shocked. I went down to the office, stood in front of the desk and said, yes, sir. He said, why did you throw that textbook out of the window on the second floor? And I said, well, the guy next to me threw mine out first. He said, that's not an excuse. And I said, yes, sir, I realize that now. He said, well, get on back to class. So that was my only run-in with Mr. Johnson.
My recollection of Mr. Johnson when he was superintendent was he'd come out and stand there in front of his office because the superintendent's office was right next door to the principal's office in the old 7th Street campus, what we called Taylor High School back in those days. And, you know, kids moving from class to class would see him standing in the hallway. There's always great respect for him. And I know people that were longtime teachers at Taylor High School always had respect for him, whether it be Ruth Manor or Carrie Camblin or Beatrice McKinley. All of those that I had back in the late 50s, early 60s had great respect for Mr. Johnson.
I graduated in 1950, and that summer they called me and wanted to know if I wanted to come work for the principal. So I did. And it was I think it was E.G. Osborne at that point. And there were just Mr. Johnson's secretary and myself in the office. And Mr. Johnson had his office on the left, the principal was on the right, and we were in this very small office space. And our office was totally lined with all of Mr. Johnson's winning football teams. There were 8x10 pictures all around that room.
This desk actually belonged to T.H. Johnson. When Dorothy Elliott, who was his daughter, called and said, we're clearing out some things, Naomi, and I just wanted to ask if you would be interested in having Daddy's desk. Well, of course, we immediately said yes in Taylor ISD, and so we were able to get the desk. Marvin Brinkmeyer actually refinished the desk, and there was a little bit of confusion because some people, I won't mention names, in the district wanted to completely redo it. And I said, no, 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 no. We just need to clean it up, touch it up, make it look presentable, and then we need to preserve it. And so here it is with a nameplate with T.H. Johnson. It's amazing. It has one pull-out drawer, 3 side drawers, and he ran the district for 19 years with this desk.
Well, I'm always very, very happy to see that that whoever makes a decision about the museum, the duck room, that they do have it focused as the centerpiece as you come in the door, because I never thought of it that way, and I always think it's a very meager expression of executive position to see that little old desk and the plainness of it. But after all, it got the job done, and that's what it's all about.
Another story I remember him talking about was desegregation back in the 60s. And he and the Department of Justice came up with a compromise plan that's still in effect today. A lot of people wonder why our schools are divided the way they are. Well, it's because of desegregation and the compromise they came up with the Department of Justice, where all the school kids that go in a particular grade would all go to a certain school, hence no discrimination. And they bought up on that, and today we still have all our kindergartners, all of our first graders, all of our second graders, all going to the same campuses. And it's a tradition that's carried on for many years. I'm sure it'll change one day, but it hasn't changed now in over 50 years.
Now, T.H. Johnson was actually the superintendent at the time that I was hired. And so Ruth Manter, who was my English teacher in high school, I think had put in a good word for me. And so T.H. Johnson sent my name to the school board, and I think it was Leon Bowles who voted that they hire me. And of course, the rest was history.
My mother especially enjoyed it here. She felt very comfortable here, and so she would stay here even when my dad, even before they sold their house in Taylor, and he would go back early in the mornings and go to the house and bathe and dress for the day. And so that would be how he handled the distance between this place and Taylor and the workspace. So so that went on for several years, but he never seemed to tire of it. Of course, he was one of those who, as my mother would say, he rested in motion. And so he was always happiest when he was moving about.
Now, I go into offices sometimes and desks take up 3/4 of the room, and then there are several tables and everything, but T.H. Johnson managed to keep records, and what a record keeper he was, for 19 years at this desk. And there are so many stories about him as a superintendent. Now, actually, I do remember that while he was superintendent, he had an office in Taylor High School, and I was a student at Taylor High School. But I really didn't know him too well at that time. But Janelle Rolock, who is now a dear friend of mine, Janelle worked for him. Janelle, and Laverne both worked in his office, and Janelle can tell some wonderful stories about the way that they collated for board meetings. And believe me, it is not the way that we do it today by running it through a machine and having it stapled and just handed out. This was the day of the hectograph, the mimeograph, and all those ancient machines that are not even words we're familiar with today.
And the thing I remember most about Mr. Johnson, he would sit in his office with his typewriter, old manual typewriter, and with 2 fingers type away just as fast as he could go. And he actually did part of the board book, and then we would run it off on the mimeograph machine and line it up around this beautiful oak board table. And Mr. Johnson was right in line going around the table with me and Lorraine McCarty picking up the board book. And then we'd staple it and we were done. And the thing I remember, when he retired, Mr. Johnson added this neat little poem that was about putting a horse out to pasture. And it was just so traumatic for us because he was just such a good person, and we loved working for him, and he was always joyous, and just, I can still hear his little laugh and see his smile.
And it was a time that we were all very comfortable. We all knew what was expected of us. We went about our daily business. And then we had a new superintendent after that, and it was not that things were not going along smoothly, but someone once said, well, we were kind of sailing along, and now where in the world is the boat? Where's the boat? Because change had come about.
In 1966, after 40 years of service with the Taylor schools, 43 years total, T.H. Johnson decided to retire. He announced his retirement at the January board meeting, and in a statement he read that evening, Mr. Johnson said he would be retiring from active duty on June 30th of 1966. In his statement he said, "The experiences which I have had down through the years of service have enriched my life and will as long as I live. May I express my heartiest good wishes for the continued success of the Taylor schools and faith in its plans for the future." The board voted unanimously to go outside the system to pick a successor and to follow a method of invitation for interviewing applicants. Mr. Johnson assured the board that he would be as dedicated in performance as if he were to be here for years to come. As the year came to a close, the 1966 yearbook was dedicated to Mr. Johnson. He signed his last board book. The board praised Mr. Johnson for all of his accomplishments, and he received a plaque in appreciation of his unselfish devotion to the Taylor Public Schools from 1926 to 1966. His service record documented a 43-year career at 3 different school districts, and now it was time for his well-deserved retirement to begin. As difficult as it must have been for Mr. Johnson to leave Taylor and all the people he had come to know and love, he would now have time to enjoy the family farm in Plum, Texas, that he loved so much. An avid fisherman, Mr. Johnson always looked forward to every fishing opportunity, including family summer vacations at Rockport and fishing trips to Lake Buchanan. And now he would have more time for his favorite hobby. Mr. Johnson loved facts and figures and was well known as a historian. Now he would have more time to write his books about Taylor football, the Taylor schools, and Texas history. He was known for producing a book for each football season that he would then give to each of the players as a keepsake from their years on the team. In addition to the books he created, T.H. Johnson also made posters showing the history of the Taylor schools, like this one on the history of Taylor football that he presented to the Taylor Public Library in 1985. Mr. Johnson's posters on various topics were displayed at businesses around town, and several of those posters found a permanent home on the walls of the boardroom when it was located in the central office on 12th Street. Mr. Johnson was frequently called upon as a resource for articles about local history in the Cotton Bowl, like this story from 1973, where he talks about his method for preparing the books that he so enjoyed writing, and historical facts like Taylor becoming the Ducks on November 5th of 1924. He was also willing to participate in live interviews, like this conversation on stage at homecoming one year. In 1980, Cotton Bowl reporter Kelly Frankeny and photographer Wiley Owen traveled to Plum, Texas to interview Mr. Johnson in his home. In this interview, Mr. Johnson talked about the time and effort he puts into making his history books, how he came to have the nickname Heck, and the autograph from Walt Disney. In 1997, the summer edition of the Taylor Daily Press, FYI, shared some of the history that T.H. Johnson had recorded about Williamson County. T.H. Johnson also published a column in the Taylor Daily Press entitled Down the Years, in which he shared interesting facts about Taylor and the Taylor schools. Although he would have many projects and interests to occupy his time in retirement, T.H. Johnson would always find whatever time was needed to keep up with his Taylor friends. He returned to Taylor often to visit, and he also invited friends to visit him at his farm. During the late 1970s and early 80s, when I worked at the Taylor Daily Press, Mr. Johnson would often stop by the newsroom on his trips back to Taylor and visit with journalist Alma Lee Holman. Mrs. Holman had been a colleague on the school staff during T.H. Johnson's coaching and teaching years. She later went to work for the newspaper, and when Mr. Johnson was promoted to superintendent, Mrs. Holman served as a member of the Taylor School Board. Mrs. Holman was always happy to see her longtime friend when he stopped by the newsroom, greeting him as he came through the door and calling him by his nickname, Heck. Later, after I became an elementary school principal with Taylor ISD, I would sometimes see Mr. Johnson when he would stop by central office for a visit. The Johnsons had peacocks on their farm, and sometimes he would bring peacock feathers to give away. I just happened to be at central office during one of those visits, and he gave me one of those feather bouquets on what just happened to be my 30th birthday, a gift that I framed and still treasure today.
He always would bring you something, if nothing more, a peacock feather. He raised peacocks, and he knew them by name, and you could go to his place. It's a beautiful setting. He always had something to show you, and he always tied in a little bit of history with it. He was just a history buff. You could go into his living area, and he had books on the shelves that he had written. Texas history, different things, and he would show me. Some of them were typed, and some of them were in handwriting, and he always thought that he would have those published. But he was a great researcher, and I really respected that from him.
But he kept detailed information about every one of those football games, about every one of them, and he kept information about every one of the players and what became of them. And fortunately, he did preserve those in the form of some little books that later I was the recipient of one of those books, and I tried to just value it with all my heart.
He was a meticulous keeper of records. He loved numbers, and he could tell you how many times, for instance, every day he left Plum, Texas, and he went to LaGrange, and he would eat at the Bonton. And when he would come to Taylor, to the central office, he would say, "Well, son," and he called us son. I think all of us that were younger. He'd say, "Son, I was at the Bonton number 192 today." And I don't know why he did that, but he liked doing it. And he seemed to get a lot of pleasure from it, and I just thought it was very, very interesting. But his life was kind of that way, I think, too. I think he was a highly organized person. And I think that's just an outflow of the way he thought about things.
He was, among all things, I think one of the main things that he was a true historian. If you want to know anything about Taylor schools, all you need to do is come to the duck room or go to the public library and access the books that he created down through the years. Every year during football season, he would assemble a book that had everything about that year's season, and I think he sent a copy to each of his boys. He always called them boys.
He kept football records from his days in the 20s from Waco. He made a book, and he sent books of all of our seasons to his captains that won championships. I know he sent us a book on each one of those teams. I got one from the team of 40 45. He also had a book on 42, 43. 44, we didn't win, but we lost one game, and that was the last game of the season.
And he also wrote a history of the Taylor Public Schools. He finished it, I think, in 1975, and I believe it ranged from 1884 to 1975. And it is a wealth. By the way, Karen Ellis, Taylor Public Librarian, I think brought it up to date to 2016. But it is such a wealth of information. For example, in there you can find that in 1910, grade 12 was added to Taylor ISD. In 1941, grade 11 was also added to Taylor ISD. Well, I think it'd be the other way around. But anyway, you find all sorts of things. You can find out that in 1903, I think the superintendent's salary was about $50 per month. We have come a long way in that regard. There's just such a wealth of information. You know, someone once said that when an older person dies, it's like losing a library. Well, when T.H. Johnson passed away, we lost several libraries. I mean, he could tell you that they paid $4.17 for certain tables that were ordered. I mean, it's just anything you wanted to know. If you look in those books, you're able to find it. Now, he could tell you, I mean, there are so many stories. He could tell you the number of times that he had eaten at his favorite cafe in LaGrange. So, I mean, anything you wanted to know, you know, he could tell you.
When we went to central office on 12th Street, that had to have been, I'm not sure of the year, but Mr. Johnson would come in from Plum, Texas, from his farm, and visit with everyone there because he knew everybody. And he would always bring a new batch of statistics that he had written up or some kind of a book that he put together. And then he would want to go out and eat with somebody. So, you know, we enjoyed his visits, and he did that regularly.
Later on, of course, I went off to college and came back in 1970 to serve as the editor down at the Taylor Daily Press. And a co-worker of mine down there that everyone will remember was Alma Lee Holman. And Alma Lee had a close relationship with Coach Johnson. I call him Coach yet. She had been, if not the first, at least one of the early female members of the Taylor School Board. And she had a close working relationship with Mr. Johnson. And as some will remember, when they would greet each other, she'd call him Heck. And I never did really understand where the term came from until recently. And I thought it was a nice compliment.
He would take off in the car and go up to Taylor and back. And if I was living out here or was here at any time and found that he was not here for a period of time, I'd call up to the school office and talk to whoever was my contact up there. Is my dad up there? Yes, well, he just left. And so whenever he'd get back here, I'd be out there. Why have you been, you really shouldn't be out on the highway like that. Oh, well, I know just exactly how to get there. And so he was never persuaded to think that he wasn't able to, or that he shouldn't be out on the highway.
And when Coach retired, he moved to Plum, Texas. And he made it a practice to call many of us at least once a month, just to say hi and see how we were doing, see if we needed anything, we were all okay. And it became something that I looked forward to so much, because every month I knew I could get a call from Coach. But we've changed a bit. Our roles have changed. We're now just really good friends, very dear friends. And he treated me as an equal. I was an adult, and he would ask me about some of the other students. We'd talk about current affairs. We'd touch on just most anything. But just talking to him was still so interesting. He had so much to contribute to the conversation. And I treasure those many, many moments that I had with Coach Johnson talking on the telephone.
At central office when I was here, we had the young ladies high school, young men too, but young ladies most of the time would fill in at noon and at different times and answer the phones for us, you know. And anyway, one of the young ladies, I won't call her name, but she was a sweet little lady. She was a sweet young lady, and she came in, and I was in the office, and she came around. She said, "Mr. Cap," she said, "you're not going to believe this." I said, "Well, what is it?" She said, "This guy calls, and he says his name is T.H. Johnson." I said, "Well, did you ever think about how maybe that school got named?" She said, "No." So I thought, you know, maybe we need to do a better job of informing our students why our school is named what it is named, whether it be Posman or Johnson. But let them always remember, you know, who kind of blazed the trail, who blazed the trail for them.
The thing I remember most is his telephone bills because he loved to call people and talk to them on the phone. And of course, being here in LaGrange, and that's where he was, or out here, every call meant a telephone expense, and it wasn't until all of a sudden the telephone bill was practically zero that I realized that there'd been a change in his routine of being in touch with people. But until that time, that was the way he kept in touch with his boys, as he called a lot of his football students and players and others that he wanted to stay in touch with. And he had a variety of people that he did stay in touch with, not just his football boys, but others in the school profession that he had known and perhaps lived in another state even, and things like that. So he did maintain quite an active list of people that he enjoyed talking with.
I've been around him many times that he would come, like I said, almost monthly, sometimes bi-monthly, to the central office, and he would go see some of the coaches and different ones. But I never saw him without a coat and tie. He was always formal. He was always Mr. Johnson to me, and I was always son to him. I think he probably called everyone son, but that's what he did.
Whenever he called, he would always call me girl. And you know, that gave me such a sense of contentment, I guess, because that's the way he treated people. He treated all people with respect. He didn't have to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He was able, through his actions and through his deeds, to show others the way that we should perform. When Mike Kaplinger was superintendent, he would call occasionally, and he would talk with Mike, and then sometimes he'd ask to speak with me, and he would always start out, "Well, girl, how are things going?" And I knew that everything was okay because he was in Plum, enjoying his life, and we were continuing in Taylor ISD.
I'm not sure he knew really what my name was, but he'd always call me son. You know, I guess he called all the young people around him son.
Well, T.H. Johnson was my grandfather. I have many fond memories The furthest back I can go was probably when I was about 6. And I remember walking the streets of Taylor, and as we would walk, he would point out different houses of who lived there. And as we'd get downtown to Main Street, he'd talk about the buildings and the bank. I remember going to the bank. Pretty much everybody we would meet were very friendly, seemed to know him, and just always had a good air about him. And so that was about as far as I can remember. I can remember going to swimming lessons, learned how to swim in Taylor. Also learned how to ride a bike on Cecilia Street.
Jack Corley, who was part owner of the Weed Corley Funeral Home, was from Mahia, and his family had been in the funeral business, so it was not a new thing for him. But he was in business with the Weed Corley Funeral Home there in Austin, and so that's how my dad was one to keep up with all of people that he had coached before, and so Jack was just one of those that he would have naturally kept up with.
But I can remember back to tell you how times were different. We were able to go and visit him in his hometown, have dinner with him one day. Well, we put the entire central office staff and the principals in 2 regular vehicles. So it shows you we didn't have a great deal of administration back at that time, but we did real well.
T.H. Johnson continued to be recognized for his many accomplishments for the rest of his life. Homecoming in 1971 was dedicated to the former superintendent and coach. Mayor Calvin Yannick proclaimed that November 5, 1971 would be T.H. Johnson Day in Taylor, Texas. Several receptions and programs were held throughout the day, and at the game that night, a trophy was presented to Mr. Johnson with an inscription listing his incredible coaching record from 1926 to 1946, 175 wins, 35 losses, and 9 ties. During the celebration, it was said that students never slept in his history classes because he made history come alive for them. And his football players never had an easy, idle time on the field. They were too busy winning. Mayor Yannick proclaimed that on November 5, 1971, the name of Main Street in Taylor, Texas, is hereby changed to T.H. Johnson Avenue. May 22nd of 1982 was also declared T.H. Johnson Day by the Taylor City Commission, as some of T.H. Johnson's former players organized a reunion with their former coach. The Taylor Daily Press reported that Taylor High School's legendary former football coach, T.H. Heck Johnson, returned to Taylor for a reunion with his boys. It was said the boys held the reunion to pay tribute to the man who had played a large and inspirational part in their early teenage life in Taylor as members of his Taylor Duck football teams. Over 120 attended the dinner at Rudy McKeska's Durango Room, and many more stopped by during the day to say hello to their former coach. Former Ducks came from 7 states as well as all over Texas, and former Superintendent E.T. Robbins traveled from San Antonio. Coach Johnson's boys presented him with a football autographed by all those present to commemorate the occasion. In 1986, T.H. Johnson was inducted into the Texas High School Coaches Association Hall of Honor along with 4 others. In the Austin Statesman, George Brazil said, "At 85, Johnson's coaching tenure at Taylor came before the birth of many of the coaches who will be at the 1986 coaching school. At least 100 of his boys can now be classified as senior citizens, dedicated youngsters who helped him make Taylor the most respected name in Central Texas high school football almost a half-century earlier. Player Walter Heap spoke of Mr. Johnson's dedication as an educator. You had to make your grades to play for him, and every morning you went to study hall that he ran. He was 50 years ahead of his time in making certain that players knew that grades came first. The Taylor School Board presented Mr. Johnson with a plaque in recognition of his selection to the Texas High School Coaches Association Hall of Honor. The plaque documented his record as head coach: 146 games, 120 wins, 22 losses, and 4 ties. It also documented his 30-game winning streak, and that the Ducks outscored the opposition 3,133 points to 761. In 1990, in a special section of the Taylor Daily Press highlighting 75 years of Taylor football, Coach Johnson's amazing record was still remembered. But of all of the awards and recognitions that were bestowed upon this well-respected Taylor Duck, the one that is still obvious in the community today is the naming of T.H. Johnson Elementary School in his honor. In response to petitions signed by local citizens, Taylor School trustees voted to name the new elementary school T.H. Johnson Elementary. The new school would serve 2nd through 5th grades, relieving crowding at the middle school annex and closing West End School and 12th Street School. Although 12th Street School was a much-loved campus and held so many happy childhood memories for generations of Taylor students, it was constructed in 1912 and consisted of 3 floors, including one at the basement level. It had become a very old and outdated building, as can be seen in the phone system that was in use in the main office at the time of the move to the new building. Now, headlines announced that Taylor's newest school would be fully modern. The new T.H. Johnson Elementary building was reported to have intercom speakers in each room, as well as a telephone connection to the office. There were heating and air conditioning controls in each room, as well as a sink and storage space for pupils' belongings. The cafeteria space may also be used as auditorium space. There are special science rooms and special arrangements for activities such as music, computer work, nurse needs, evaluation of pupil potential, and counseling. The gymnasium was described as another bright spot, with special carpeting and colorful stripes outlining game areas. One of the final actions of the construction company was to place the name of the school on the column at the front entrance. Then T.H. Johnson becomes a named building, as well as an honored person whose concern for Taylor and its schools has endeared him to the heart of the community. Principal Ivan Leshper reported that teachers and students would help move to the new building on the last day of the 82-83 school year, so that they would know just where to come when the 83-84 term began in August. The school was dedicated on Sunday, August 14th of 1983, with hundreds of Taylorites, past and present, on hand to celebrate the opening of T.H. Johnson Elementary School. The Taylor High School band played, the Boy Scouts raised the flags, and there was thunderous applause as T.H. Johnson cut the green ribbon to open the school for the afternoon's program and for the start of school. Once inside, local journalist Alma Lee Holman introduced her longtime friend, and when he stepped up to the microphone, the first words spoken by this former coach were, "This is more fun than beating Georgetown." He called the school a wonderful contribution to the parents, the boys and girls of the 1980s and future decades. His love of history and facts came through as he told the crowd that this building project was the 14th bond for the Taylor schools. And he reminded everyone that the teacher is the most important person in the school system, and he urged each teacher to make every hour count because, he said, you have each girl and boy 900 hours during the school year. He encouraged them to meet their students with enthusiasm, organization, and preparedness. And he told the crowd, "Your desire to have my name a part of this beautiful building for its lifetime is the greatest and most cherished event in my life." His boys, former Taylor High School athletes whom Johnson had coached, presented a portrait of their mentor to be displayed in the new building. And the school board presented Mr. Johnson with a framed picture of the building. Mr. Johnson was joined by several family members who were present for the ceremony, and a plaque commemorating the opening of the school was placed at the front entrance. 12th Street Principal Ivan Leshper was named the principal of T.H. Johnson Elementary School. That's right, that high school student in the long-sleeve green shirt that was summoned to Mr. Johnson's office for throwing a textbook out the window would now serve as the first principal of the new school named in honor of the former superintendent. The staff quickly became a family that first year, and many recall the fun times they had while working together to teach the students. Just as Mr. Johnson continued to correspond with former students for the rest of his life, he frequently corresponded with fourth grade teacher Mary Lou Haase and her class. In a letter he wrote to them at the end of that first year, he told them they had made history by being the first pupils in this new building. He gave them an idea of what to expect throughout their school career until graduating in the spring of 1992 at the age of 18. Mr. Johnson enjoyed visiting the campus very much, and he would have loved knowing that years later, when T.H. Johnson Elementary became a pre-K and kindergarten campus, that his great-great-granddaughter attended school here.
I was one of the very, very lucky employees of Taylor ISD to get to experience a move from a very, very old school with 3 flights of stairs and the move to a brand new school, which was T.H. Johnson Elementary. As a secretary of 12th Street School, I got the feel from students, teachers, parents. Everybody felt the excitement of going into a new school. 12th Street School, you could not, it was old. You could not deny that it was aging and had a basement. PE was in the basement, and then we go up to the, for 4th graders on the 3rd floor. So as you can tell by my phone, it's really old and it's really heavy. It is heavy. So it was aging. Everything was going to be, moving into the new building was going to be so modern. New phones, and I'm sure, if I can remember correctly, that phone was not this heavy. It had several lines. Of course, this one has several lines too that I would punch. But pretty much teachers, parents, students were very excited to be moving into a brand new school, a brand new building with the things that come with it, modern technology, modern phones, modern carpet or better carpet. I don't remember us having carpet at 12th Street School, maybe rugs, but worn out rugs, but just the newness of a new building. And I think, I really do feel that the whole community was ready to move on from 12th Street School to a brand new school named after such a great man, which I'm sure a lot of the community knew, Mr. T.H. Johnson. The younger generation probably didn't, but they were going to get to know him real soon because we were fortunate to have him come and be part of the dedication. So just a very exciting time for everyone, for really everybody involved.
It was very rewarding, I thought. Made us feel very good about the fact that he would have been honored in that way. And I know his family, several members of his family from Waco came down and were there at that opening, the ribbon cutting.
As for the T.H. Johnson Elementary School, I remember it was built in '82. I think it opened in '83. I was there when they had the open house. Talked to him on occasion before it happened. Took great pride in that. He viewed it as an appreciation for his work in Taylor. He took great pride in the campus. He really enjoyed the opening. He got to visit with so many people that he had known for such a long period of time, and got to renew a lot of friendships and see people he hadn't seen in many years. So I remember that day as being a very happy day and joyous occasion for him as well.
Lots of people, and I know it was a very nice affair. I had my kids, my son Rob, and my wife was there, and remember the ceremony cutting, and just a nice thing. It really didn't sink in because I knew what he had done, but I just never knew it was that much, and so it just really brought home again just what an amazing man he was.
He was so well respected that that's why they named the school for him and the street. We need more people like that we can honor with things like buildings and streets and other things, because it is important for us to remember not only the history of our community, but in the schools in particular.
I had the honor of being principal at T.H. Johnson Elementary School, named after Mr. Johnson. And I was thrilled because I knew of his accomplishments. I can remember Mr. Johnson coming back when the school was named after him, and how proud he was. We went back later on, he would come to homecoming games. And I found out he would visit the coach, but he would visit us at school. And I had a teacher that was really a live wire, and they wrote letters, the schools wrote letters to him and the players. And he always went down to visit Miss Hosey's class for a period of time.
Everybody was so happy and excited to get to meet the person that the school was named after. They shook his hand and they wanted to ask questions. And that's one thing Mr. Johnson was very, very good at. He was ready to answer the students' questions, my questions as the school secretary. We had questions for him, where he lived, did he have kids, did he have a family? So yes, everybody was just eager to and very happy to get to meet him and shake his hand, and then later on say, I got to shake Mr. Johnson's hand. So just a very exciting time for everybody. Mr. Leshper was our principal at 12th Street School, an amazing man, I want to add. And he would take the staff to visit the new building as it was being built. And I really didn't, I cared about school, but it really was more into the office part because that's where I was going to work. And I knew everything was going to be new.
Well, one of the things about T.H. Johnson as a principal, I had a wonderful staff. The teachers were great, the aides were unbelievable, and the kids seemed to have fun and enjoy school every day. And my deal as a principal, I wanted kids to have fun at school. And basically we just had 3 rules. Follow the teacher's directions, work hard as you can, and after you do that, you have fun.
There were some fun times. That's all I can say. There were some fun times at T.H. Johnson. Looking forward to the relays, the field trips. We were family there, with Mr. Lushber leading the pack, leading us. We were close. We became family. We remember well, very well, the teachers that were once there. Still today, I can go to HEB and see students from that I started with. Those students have become parents. Some of them become grandparents. So it's all family. We were very close and really enjoyed being part of such a great school.
And a funny story happened the first year of the school. I was trying to walk in classrooms and I was walking into the air-conditioned closets instead. So it took me a while to be acclimated to the deal. I take great pride in representing Mr. Johnson when I was principal at T.H. Johnson, when the student, teachers, and aide won the Academic Excellent Award presented. It was a contest by the federal government Department of Education. And TH was one of the 21 schools, and we competed with schools all over the nation, private, parochial, and public. And because of the hard work of my staff, I got to go to Washington, D.C. And I got to accept the Academic Excellence flag in honor of our school from Bill Bennett, who was the secretary, and really had a wonderful time of being invited to the White House and having lemonade with President Reagan. And unfortunately, my wife went along, but they wouldn't let her in. So it was great to come back with that flag and have Mr. Johnson come for the ceremony. And we proudly hung that flag below the national and state flag for years until it got a little old.
The Johnson Home Place is a working farm located in Plum, Texas on the Colorado River. While Mr. Johnson did enjoy the peaceful setting there, living on a farm requires a lot of work, and he spent many hours caring for and maintaining the cattle, pastures, and fences, as well as all the other duties that come with farm life. Mrs. Johnson enjoyed the peaceful setting as well, including painting beautiful pictures of the river and other areas of the home place. Family photos line the walls, and a variety of other memorabilia can be seen around the house.
A friend, and I think my mother would question that term, a friend gave them a peacock. That family lived out near Copeland, and they had peacocks on their land, and she thought that it would just be great to give my mother a peacock. And so Mother was so happy to get them because she loved birds and animals of all sorts. And so she brought the little thing home, and it grew and grew to be a big peacock. And it roosted in that tree right out there. Never deviated from where it would roost. But anyway, all of a sudden, I guess peacocks are like other feathered friends. They attract each other, and all of a sudden there was another peacock to arrive, and then another one, and finally there was a whole herd of those little things. And while they were very beautiful, they do mess up any surface that you might have, and especially out in the carport or on the porch or anything like that. So you kind of had a mixed emotion about, after a while, you had a mixed emotion about the peacocks. But they were beautiful, there's no doubt about it. And Mother did enjoy them.
When we first moved here, I think we had, at one time I think there was a total of 50 peacocks here. Somehow that sticks in my mind. When we moved here, there's about 20. And they gradually, we started getting a lot of coyotes and everything. They just started disappearing. And probably up until about 15 years ago, we had the last peacock was gone.
If there's anything he loved more than Taylor, it would be his home place in Plum, Texas. He raised cattle out there. He planted, shredded the property, plowed. He had a good time with his cattle. He told me, he said, on more than one occasion, he said, when I die, I want to come back as an egret. I looked at him, I said, an egret? He said, yeah. He said, I can walk amongst my cattle and still be on the home place. And I always thought, well, that's kind of neat. And that to this day, I cannot see an egret without thinking of T.H. Johnson.
My mother was not a people person, and she enjoyed the solitude, I guess you'd say, of the farm, and it meant that she was not required to do social activities and things like that, and that she could just walk around in her jeans or her old shoes and enjoy the birds and the nature itself. And so she was happiest when she was down here. Well, she was very talented, really, in handwork. She did, as young ladies did before they got married. They would do china painting, which she did, and I'll show you some of the china painting that she did. And at that time, that was before she got married.
I was able to come down here quite a bit during my childhood. I remember coming down on weekends and holidays, Christmases. We spent quite a few Christmases down here. And summers, I like to come down here during the summertime. And it's kind of hard to say whether I stayed a week or two or a month or two, but it seemed like I was down here quite a bit. Might only been for a couple of days, and they said, come pick your son up. But anyway, it was very relaxing. I never got grilled about, how's life going. It was just always very pleasant. Could always be myself, and learned a lot. I saw calves being born. Whenever the cows would come, sometimes they'd have problems delivering calves, and he and I would go pull a calf. And he did a lot of things himself, veterinarian-wise, taking care of the cows and stuff. So that was always interesting. I started out young driving tractors. He didn't mind putting me on the tractor when I was, I guess, 9 or 10, and shredding. And so, because he had 2 little red tractors, and I got to get one of them, and we'd shred side by side. And every time I start to lose concentration and start doing donuts or something, he was there to tell me that's not how we shred. And so that pays off now when I'm taking over doing the shredding. I keep my lines straight and keep the rows straight and everything all cut nice and clean, because that's the way he liked it. And so that just always was instilled in me to do a good job shredding.
Well, on a farm, it's mostly what do you need to be doing, and whether you enjoy it or not. And so I think that's what it really got reduced to. He used to laugh sometimes and say, what we need to call this place is the belly acres, and and because it required a lot of work to anything you did. It just required a lot of work. He would, and actually, since my mother had passed away, and my dad was still functioning. He would get on the tractor. There would be no one here to tell him, you shouldn't get on that tractor. You know, it might be dangerous. You might hurt yourself and no one would know. But there was no one to do that, so I didn't live here. And of course, being an only child, there was no one else to take over or anything like that. So he was left up to his own device and his own decisions. And if I did say something about, now Dad, you really shouldn't be doing that, he'd say, oh, I know how to do this just fine.
My wife and I, we moved here full-time in 1996. And for the past 22 years, it's been an effort just trying to maintain and improve what was already here when we started. I think we counted one time there was 14 outbuildings, little pump houses and chicken coops and barns and stuff, and now we're down to about 6. And we've gone into a hay operation, which has never been done on the farm, and we started recently doing the cattle. And as you saw on the tour that we took, it's laid out pretty much the same as I remember it as a kid. And so it's been a real pleasure. It's a lot of work. If you miss a day or two, you're about 2 or 3 weeks behind. So, and if we get some rain, then you're really behind. So sometimes the droughts are nice because I don't have to mow as much. But after a 3-inch rain like we had last week, as you can tell, the weeds are starting to come up and the grass is starting to come up, and so it's a constant project. Well, the river is it's been very interesting, especially since we've lived here full time. And I know it used to come up quite a bit when I was younger, but I was either always in Austin. But living here, especially during Hurricane Harvey, it was the highest that I had ever seen it. Right out the back of the house, came up right to the back porch of this house that we're in now, and it was 54 feet, and it was pretty amazing. The road coming in was underwater. My wife and I had put everything up. We have our house that we live in. We put everything up on scaffolding, and we were expecting a couple of feet of water in there, and thank God nothing happened. We were saved. So, but the rain as the river comes up really contaminates the hayfields with weeds and stuff. So that's been a constant battle now. But it's a fun project. And Granddaddy told me one time, he was sitting right over there, I guess it was about 96. He said the farm is what kept him so young. And so just really enjoy it.
I think it's just remarkable the relationship he had with his wife. And I think that says a lot about a man. He talked about her in such a loving way, and would just he would take her places, he would wait for her, and whereas I would complain about having to wait, it was kind of a badge of honor for him, I think. He really liked doing things for his wife, and she was a charm to him. When she passed away, I was down that way, and we were in the house, and he said that he had a recliner in the living room stretched out with some bedding, and I said, well, it looked like you almost made a bed here, just kind of joking. And he said, yes. He said, I just can't go in that bedroom by myself right now. And I thought, wow, what a touching monument to his wife. It just, that was such a blessed place for him.
Mr. Johnson lost the love of his life when his wife, Martha Jane Morgan Johnson, passed away in May of 1989. In 1995, Mr. Johnson celebrated his 94th birthday with a celebration given by the Live Longer and Like It organization of the First Baptist Church in LaGrange. It was noted that Mr. Johnson still lived on the family farm in Plum, Texas at that time. In a biography that was read about him at the party, the hostess referred to Mr. Johnson's nickname, Heck, a name his sister-in-law called him, and said, "We think of him as a heck of a man." In 1999, Mr. Johnson celebrated his 98th birthday with family at the Marriott Brighton Gardens, where he now lived in Austin, Texas. His daughter, Dorothy, said that for 98, Coach is in pretty good health, and although he is wheelchair-bound these days and can no longer drive a car, he does cruise the halls of Brighton Gardens, and he still loves to wear his Taylor duck cap, and he especially looks forward to receiving the Taylor Daily Press. Mr. Johnson remained a proud Taylor duck for the rest of his life. On April 1st, 2000, Thomas Heskill Johnson passed away at the age of 99. Tributes were written about the legendary educator, and many of his friends from Taylor attended the service in LaGrange. In the eulogy, Mike Kaplinger gave an overview of a few of the qualities that people loved about Mr. Johnson. He was the original head duck. He was always dressed to the T. He was a mentor to so many. He cared about people, and people flocked around him. He had a heart for the Taylor schools, a passion for details, and a lifetime of contributions. He was an encourager. He would always tell you you were doing a great job. You felt good just being around him. You didn't have to look hard to see his character and his faith. And finally, Mr. Kaplinger closed the eulogy by saying, "When Mr. Johnson reached the pearly gates, I would bet that he took a good look at St. Peter, removed his hat, and said, 'Son, you're doing a great job.'" T.H. Johnson was laid to rest in the Plum Grove Cemetery next to his wife, and as you might guess, there is a mallard duck on his headstone.
I think if I wanted to share what I have taken from Mr. Johnson, I think it would be that those positive vibes, the encouragement. He would always be encouraging when he came to the office. He'd always say something good. You would always receive a compliment from him. You know, things are looking good. You know, and even though you know it's about to fall apart, he always had some kind of a positive attitude.
T.H. Johnson was, he's an icon. I mean, he is truly a Taylor icon.
He was always very congenial, very happy, always dressed in a suit. He was just a real joyful person. He smiled a lot, never heard him raise his voice, never heard him say words that would be inappropriate for a mixed crowd. Just a very sincere gentleman.
I never saw him in a bad mood at all. I never saw him anything but encouraging.
But I do treasure those many phone calls. It's strange that you would look forward to sitting and talking on the phone to somebody that was your former coach and teacher. It's just an unusual relationship. But everything about him was unusual. He was a remarkable man. And you know, in all those years, and all the years since, I've never heard anyone say an ugly word about him. Only good things. He was just such a good person, and everybody loved him.
he led as much by example, by the way that he did things.
A true legend. And I'm so grateful that he was a part of my life. And I hope that somehow these stories that we tell will make him come alive to all the people who didn't have the opportunity to know him.
It has been said that T.H. Johnson's success might be found in his intense interest in the individuals with whom he came in contact. He knew every student. He knew each student's strengths and each student's weaknesses, and he was always available for consultation and for gentle guidance. It has also been said that when the eventual history of education in Taylor, Texas is written, that much space will be devoted and a large part of the credit given to T.H. Johnson. It is our goal that this video will preserve the story of Thomas Heskill Johnson for future generations. As Taylor begins to grow, may we always remember and cherish our rich heritage. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. And remember, once a duck, always a duck.